Thank you for coming today. I want to do a presentation on Ansel Adams. And I studied with Ansel's assistant, John Sexton. Oh, no, it's probably 15 years ago because I got into the darkroom and was doing black and white. And I had seen some of Ansel's original prints in Chicago at the Art Institute and realized they were just superb black and white prints. And I wanted to learn how to do that level of black and white. And I talked with someone about that black and white, and they said, well, Ansel one time said, it'll take 10 years to get to be a true fine art black and white printer. And of course, he was talking about the darkroom. And I thought, no problem. In about a year, 2 years, I'll have this mastered. Well, 10 years later, I thought maybe another year or two I'll get to produce really great black and white prints. But I think this statement is so good. An image is not just a place, it is an experience. And for me, that also relates to the fact that it is not the equipment that makes good photography. It's your mind. It's what you see and how you see it, and then what you do with it after you've captured those initial pixels. Now, he was dealing with negatives, as you'll see. Creativity from reality is what I think. And so fine art photographs are really created from reality and fulfilling the creative vision of the photographer. That comes from him. And I think, yes, indeed, that's exactly what it is. Well, if any of you know about him, you may know that he had a burro that carried all his equipment up into the hills and things. So see if you remember the name of the burro. And I will give you the name at the end. It's really interesting, but he did have a burro to carry all of his equipment. Ansel, I'm going to talk about three parts to this today: the man, the influences of his life on his art, how did that evolve? And then the negative, the influences of his of various crafts that he got into and how it created fine art photography. And the last part is the print, truly the influences of his various techniques. And they carry forward today tremendously, especially in the black and white, but even in color prints today, the concepts are the same. The man, the influences of his life. Well, he was born in 1902 in February. And by the way, that's my birth year also, February 20th. I was born February 24th. How about that? Anyway, 1902. They lived in San Francisco area off to the far west of the city, right on the coast, that little house up on the hill. And he would play on the beach. So he was being influenced by the world as he was growing up. His father was a tremendous influence on him. And in 1950, the Pan-Pacific Exposition was held. And that structure, by the way, on the right-hand side, is still in San Francisco. And I was overwhelmed when I first went out there and saw that, didn't even know that it was something that Ansel had seen. But he was in 1950, so now he's 13 years old, and his father takes him there. He was taken so much with all the activity and the arts and everything that was going on that he skipped school that year. He didn't go to school. And so in 13 years old, he had this little camera and he photographed the architecture. So this is his first photograph. Then he went to Yosemite with his parents. They took him there. He was 14 years old. They took him there. They would get there by train and then wagon train, first rail and then wagon train in order to get in there. And he had this little Instamatic camera that we would call an Instamatic. And he photographed some things and was so well taken with it that he decided to continue to do that kind of work. Well, one of his most famous is this one, Clearing Winter Storm, taken from a point called Inspiration Point. Well, as he was in Yosemite, he was so taken with Yosemite and the beauty of it, as I have been. And as a result of him, I just was so taken with the beauty of Yosemite. And one of the things about Yosemite National Park is that when you are in it, you truly are in it. There are 2,000 foot walls all around the Central Valley. It's not that you were just looking from an upper level on down, except for Inspiration Point. And Ansel wanted to get above the people who were visitors who would come in there. So he built a platform on top of his Pontiac, and he would take his, that's an 8x10 negative camera that he used. He really had studied to be a pianist, and he wanted to be a concert pianist. But as he got more and more into the photography, he switched from that to photography. But he always carried forward his talent for music. Why is he considered one of the greats? Well, here's what happened at the time he got very serious with photography. Pictorialism was the type of photography being done at the time. And it was artistic in a certain way, but very pictorial. He said, no, 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 it should be realism. And so he started a movement called modernism. And that movement was started with Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham. And they called it the group F64. And of course, F64 represents the exposure on the camera. And so when you're doing a large format camera, an 8x10 or even a 5x7, you put lenses on there, and the f-stop, you can go up to 100 f-stop. On our 35 millimeter cameras, maybe you get an f-stop of f22 or f32, but in those days with those cameras, because of the bellows and you need a certain amount of aspects for sharpness, f64 was the common f-stop for the lens. So the three of them, Edward Weston, Imogen Cunningham, and Ansel. Now, you see Edward's fingers? You know why they are black? No, he was not putting nail polish on his fingers. That is from the chemicals of developing his prints in the chemical. That's what that's from. It turned the nails black. Mm-hmm. Ansel did 6x8 large format, then he went up to the 8x10 view camera and on top of his Pontiac so that he could get a whole different perspective of the scene. Think about that. I often, when I'm doing a workshop, have people say, get down low so that you get a different perspective, because the tendency is to be at the height of whatever you are, and that's your perspective. No, he would get up onto the top of the car and give him a very different perspective. He got into the darkroom, of course, and he was making his own prints. And he learned a lot of that from Edward Weston. And when he got in there, he realized that he wanted to make much larger prints. So instead of the enlarger pointing downward, he had it set up so that it would expose to the wall, and he could put a large piece of paper on the wall and expose. So it was very large, and he would do burning and dodging in the darkroom. And he would even, heavens forbid, spot a print with ink. It's really a spotting fluid. So he would fill in white areas where he needed, and he often would use a knife and scratch off pieces of the negative, which would have turned out to be white on the final print, but he wanted it to be black or vice versa. So he actually adjusted the negatives in a number of ways. He then met Paul Strand, who was very, very good photographer. And Paul Strand showed him negatives to the level of having detail in the shadows and detail in the highlights. And he also was doing large format negatives. So I think they were 8x10s. And so he introduced Ansel to the 8x10 and to the aspect that the negative should have all the detail that's necessary to be shown on the final print. These are all Strand's negatives and then final print. So Ansel, that was 1925. Ansel just fell in love with Yosemite, and he eventually becomes, he lives there. He's a janitor in a sense, working in one of the areas uh, there and set up a darkroom. So Monolith, the face of Half Dome, was one of his first major steps forward because he's hiking up the side of Half Dome and he's looking out there to see that. And he walks up to that little ledge that you see on the lower right hand corner. He walks up there with his large 8x10 and he's thinking, oh, the sky is just pure blue. But he takes the shot and he gets all the details and the highlights and the shadows, everything. And then he put a red filter on the camera. And it was the first time that he had a black sky because red blocks blue. So the red filter on the camera, when he captured the film on the film then would print as dark, and this half dome and the snow and the top ridge would be white against the black, which would create what I'm calling three-dimensionality. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But it was the first major step for him of putting on a filter to change the aspects of light and capturing it on the negative. 1927. So he was born in 1902, so he's 25 years old. As a result of learning the aspects of details in the shadows and details in the highlights, he defined and produced what was called the zone system. Everything from pure black to pure white, and know in every part of the image where the tone is, so that he would know that he'd have detail in the shadows. And in most cases, he wanted the shadows to, if you look at the top, it says 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10. And zone 2, the third one from the left, is the first zone really where you get to have some shadow with detail. And zone 3 is the best. You see at the bottom of the fence that line comes down, and that's where zone 3 is located. There's detail that's dark, but it's detail. Where you see the steeple in the background is almost pure black, not pure black, but almost there. And there is nothing in this print, in this image, that is pure white. So he was always careful. And every one of those zones was one stop change in exposure. That's how he defined the zone system. So we will look at some aspects of his work. Monolith, the face of Half Dome, that's the first one that he produced and had that red filter. I'll talk about Clearing Winter Storms, and I will talk about the other ones here, the expressive, I call them expressive prints, Gates of the Valley, Oak Tree, and so on. We'll go through those and you'll see his work. But he also studied Timothy O'Sullivan's work. There was a book out by Timothy O'Sullivan, and Sullivan had photographed in Canyon de Chelly and a lot of other areas in the late 1800s, large black and white, and Ansel studied his work. And this is White House ruins in Canyon de Chelly, which is still there today. And one of the things that drove me out in that area was to go visit Canyon de Chelly and to see the White House ruins and where did Ansel photograph. So in 1873, Timothy O'Sullivan. And later in 1942, Ansel produced this image on the right, White House ruins. Look at the improvement, in a sense, of the composition, where he has placed the White House ruins and the difference of how they stand out. But you also notice that on Timothy O'Sullivan's black and white, there's detail in the shadow areas and detail in the highlights, especially you can see on my monitor, and so does Ansel's. And so he's really very sensitive to the zone system and capturing and doing the exposures in a way that the film will have everything he needs to produce a print. And the other irony of all that is at the time Ansel was shooting these kinds of images, film did not have a consistent ISO. It could vary. You could have the film rated as 100, but when you shoot it, it's really only a 50 or a 125. And so he would shoot an image twice. He would capture it with two different exposures, go home and develop the first negative, and see if he needed to do adjustments in the development of the second negative to contain all the detail in the shadows and not blow out the highlights. So his first point, going up to inspiration point in 1935, and he was just taken with the whole valley. You see in the center of the print in the back, that's Half Dome, Bridalveil Falls in the lower right area. And so he captured this image. And there's an aspect here that stands out that I think is important. You'll see it even more so. You see in the far lower right corner, there's a tree sticking up. Ansel is becoming very sensitive to foreground, middle ground, background. And that tree creates even more of a sense of foreground to watch. So as he goes forward in 1940, actually that was 35, yes. In 1940, he goes back up to the same location now in winter, and you see the foreground is more prominent, middle ground, background, and the sky is just very nice, but it can't compare to what he then produced in 1944, Clearing Winter Storm. And this became the most important print of his. I saw an original of this in Chicago. It is superb, just truly superb. All the detail and the fine printing. This is just striking. Oh, the interesting thing about this location, it's so easy to get to. When you go into Yosemite and you drive up the one road up to this, they now have a large parking lot at that location. And so everybody gets to see that scene from the parking lot. Ansel said, I feel that a future work, true work of art is like nothing else in the world. It is not essential to know how the artist thinks or how he believes he relates to his profession or his society. What he creates is his message. None of that other stuff is important. It's what he creates that is his message. And his other most famous print is this one. This is one of my favorites. Gates of the Valley, because I've been at that location so many times. Oh, and that location is on the main road in the valley. So when you drive in and go around the Central Valley, it's a one-way road. You stop, there's another parking lot. You stop right at this location and look across. That's El Capitan on the left, and forget the name, and the ones on the right. And in the middle, because the clouds are there, you can't see El Capitan or Half Dome, but it's there. But here's some interesting things about this image. He has a foreground and he's maneuvered the camera so that he has a highlight against a shadow, which creates three-dimensionality. You'll watch, and more as you see it, as we go through his images, how he is very sensitive to the composition of the image so that it creates that three-dimensionality. So that's a light against dark is a three-dimensional aspect. A dark against light is a three-dimensional aspect. So waiting for those clouds to move in a certain way so that everything is standing out three-dimensionally. This one is on the far western side of the national park in Lone Pine, California. He's there one day. He shoots a lot over there. And so he's there. And this, by the way, is a proof sheet, which means he took the negative, laid it on the enlarger on paper, and just exposed it to see what he had captured. So this is his base exposure. Children, maybe the teen, whatever, some of the kids from Lone Pine had climbed up the mountain and carved into the mountain or painted LP up there. So when he did the negative, it had LP in it, and he scratched that off before he made the final print, scratched it off the negative. This is the way he presented that print from there, but you see he has detail everywhere. So he knows he can make that into this kind of image. Some very important things about this. He's standing on top of his car, waiting for that horse to turn sideways. And the light was just on the horse. So he says, I'm standing there in one of the books, he's right. He said, I'm standing there waiting because the horse had its butt to him. He wanted a sideway view. And so he's there and he's thinking, oh, the light is going to go before the horse turns. The horse turned, he got the shot, and the light went away. Wow. timing. Here's a light area or a dark, middle dark area against a lighter area in the background, dark against the light all across that. And if you remember, here's the original. So he's emphasizing those aspects. And he has that highlight in the bottom with a darker area along the absolute bottom of the print. And then that matches up to the top area where he has a dark area on the top. And that struck me so much related to how should I control the viewer's eye? Well, if something's dark at the top, it brings the eye down into the image. Something dark at the bottom pushes your eye up and your eye will go to the lightest areas.